In 1940, Germany's military planners calculated that the Reich had enough oil reserves to sustain major operations for approximately 6 months. They presented these figures to Hitler with a clear recommendation: secure reliable oil sources before expanding the war further. Germany controlled no major oil fields. Its synthetic fuel plants could not meet wartime demand. Romanian imports covered only a fraction of military requirements. The professional assessment was unanimous: without securing oil supplies first, Germany would eventually face fuel shortages that would cripple military operations regardless of tactical success. Hitler dismissed these warnings. He ordered the expansion of military operations into the Soviet Union and multiple other fronts without first securing the oil that modern mechanized warfare required. That decision, to expand the war before solving the fuel problem, meant that Germany would fight the rest of the conflict with one hand tied behind its back, watching its tanks run dry while its enemies operated with secure fuel supplies. Modern mechanized warfare consumed fuel at rates that previous conflicts never approached. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, and ships all required petroleum products in massive quantities. Germany had conquered most of Europe by 1940, but territorial expansion did not solve its fundamental resource problem. The Reich had virtually no domestic oil production. Germany produced less than 5% of its petroleum needs from natural sources. Every gallon that powered a Panzer or a Luftwaffe fighter had to come from somewhere else. The mathematics were simple and inflexible. Germany's enemies, Britain with access to Middle Eastern oil, the Soviet Union with Caucasus fields, and potentially the United States with its enormous domestic production, all possessed secure petroleum supplies. Germany did not. This was not a temporary disadvantage that could be overcome through tactical brilliance or operational success. It was a structural weakness that threatened every aspect of military operations. German strategic planners understood the oil problem and had identified potential solutions. The Middle East held vast oil reserves that Britain controlled. The Caucasus region of the Soviet Union contained major oil fields. Securing either would provide Germany with the petroleum foundation that modern war required. There was also a third option: complete the synthetic fuel program before expanding military operations. Germany had invested heavily in coal-to-oil conversion technology, but the plants needed time and resources to reach sufficient production levels. Each option had clear requirements. Seizing Middle Eastern oil meant defeating Britain first. Taking Caucasus oil required focusing solely on southern Russia. Completing synthetic fuel meant delaying major operations for years. All three options shared one thing: they required making oil security the primary strategic objective before territorial expansion. Germany would have to choose between securing resources first or expanding territory first. Hitler made his decision based on ideology rather than logistics. In his worldview, territorial conquest and racial empire came first. Resource security was something that would follow from military victory, not something that needed to be established before victory could be achieved. He believed that German military superiority would overcome resource limitations through rapid campaigns that seized territory faster than fuel could be consumed. The oil would come later, after the space was conquered. This was not a calculated strategic gamble. It was ideological certainty that military operations could proceed without first solving the fuel equation. When planners argued that mechanized forces could not operate indefinitely without secure fuel supplies, Hitler interpreted this as defeatist thinking. He insisted that willpower and tactical excellence would overcome material constraints. The decision was made: Germany would expand the war immediately and secure oil resources as opportunities arose during the conquest. German military logistics officers and economic planners understood exactly what Hitler's decision meant. General George Thomas, who headed Wehrmacht economic planning, compiled detailed reports showing that fuel shortages would constrain operations within months of major campaigns beginning. He calculated that without secure oil supplies, Germany could not sustain simultaneous operations on multiple fronts. Luftwaffe logistics officers reported that fighter defense of Germany would compete with bomber operations for limited aviation fuel. Panzer commanders noted that mechanized operations required fuel logistics that current reserves could not support for extended campaigns. The Navy warned that submarine operations depended on fuel oil that was increasingly scarce. These were not theoretical concerns or pessimistic projections. They were mathematical calculations based on consumption rates and available supplies. Every professional assessment reached the same conclusion: expanding the war without first securing oil was strategically unsustainable regardless of tactical outcomes. Germany's primary oil source was Romania's Ploiești fields, and this dependency created its own vulnerabilities. Romanian production could meet perhaps 30% of German military requirements. The fields were exposed to potential Allied bombing. Political instability in Romania meant supply was not guaranteed. Most critically, Romanian oil was not enough. It could supplement German synthetic fuel production, but it could not sustain the massive mechanized operations that Blitzkrieg doctrine required. German planners knew this. They had calculated exactly how long Romanian supplies would last under various operational scenarios. Every scenario showed the same result: fuel shortages would emerge within months of sustained operations. Hitler acknowledged the dependency on Romania but treated it as adequate because he assumed campaigns would be quick. The planning assumption was that Germany would win rapid victories and then secure additional oil sources from conquered territory. This was hoping that fuel problems would solve themselves rather than ensuring adequate supplies before operations began. Germany's primary oil source was Romania's Ploiești fields, and this dependency created its own vulnerabilities. Romanian production could meet perhaps 30% of German military requirements. The fields were exposed to potential Allied bombing. Political instability in Romania meant supply was not guaranteed. Most critically, Romanian oil was not enough. It could supplement German synthetic fuel production, but it could not sustain the massive mechanized operations that Blitzkrieg doctrine required. German planners knew this. They had calculated exactly how long Romanian supplies would last under various operational scenarios. Every scenario showed the same result: fuel shortages would emerge within months of sustained operations. Hitler acknowledged the dependency on Romania but treated it as adequate because he assumed campaigns would be quick. The planning assumption was that Germany would win rapid victories and then secure additional oil sources from conquered territory. This was hoping that fuel problems would solve themselves rather than ensuring adequate supplies before operations began. Within months of Barbarossa's launch, fuel shortages began affecting German operations. Panzer divisions reported they were stationary not because of combat losses but because of fuel shortages. Luftwaffe squadrons reduced sortie rates to conserve aviation fuel. Supply units struggled to move fuel forward to advancing forces while also needing fuel for their own trucks. The logistics officers had predicted this. They had calculated consumption rates and warned that penetrating deep into Soviet territory would strain fuel supplies past breaking point. But the warnings had been dismissed as excessive caution. Now the predictions were proving accurate. German forces were achieving tactical victories but could not exploit them because mechanized units sat immobile waiting for fuel. The operational tempo that had defined Blitzkrieg's success was slowing not because of Soviet resistance but because German logistics could not sustain the fuel demands that mechanized warfare required. The problem was not temporary. It was structural and worsening. In 1942, Hitler finally prioritized securing Soviet oil by directing army groups south toward the Caucasus fields. This was the oil-first strategy that planners had recommended in 1940, now being attempted in 1942 after fuel shortages had already constrained operations for a year. But the strategic situation had changed. Soviet forces had rebuilt. German logistics were stretched. Most critically, the operation competed with the assault on Stalingrad for limited resources including fuel. German forces advancing toward Caucasus oil were doing so while already suffering from the fuel shortages that securing those fields was meant to solve. They were consuming their last reserves trying to reach the supply that would solve their consumption problem. The operational paradox was unsolvable. By the time Germany made oil security a priority, German forces lacked the fuel to reach the oil. The Caucasus offensive stalled. The oil fields remained in Soviet hands. Germany's fuel crisis continued worsening. Germany's other option for securing oil, seizing Middle Eastern fields from British control, was never seriously attempted despite its strategic importance. Rommel's Africa Corps operated in North Africa, but it was never given resources for a serious drive toward Middle Eastern oil. The campaign was treated as a supporting effort rather than a strategic priority. German forces fought well tactically but lacked the logistics and reinforcements needed to push beyond Egypt toward Iraq and Iran where vast oil reserves existed. This was the persistent pattern. Germany fought for territory rather than resources. Even when opportunities existed to secure oil, operational priorities focused on tactical victories and territorial gains instead of resource security. The failure in North Africa meant that British access to Middle Eastern oil remained intact while Germany continued depending on inadequate Romanian supplies and insufficient synthetic production. Every month the war continued without securing alternative oil sources made Germany's fuel situation more desperate. Germany had invested heavily in synthetic fuel production, hoping technology could solve what geography denied. Coal-to-oil conversion plants were built across Germany and occupied territory. By 1944, these facilities produced about half of Germany's petroleum needs. But synthetic production had inherent limitations. The plants required enormous resources to build and operate. They were vulnerable to bombing. Most critically, they could not scale up quickly enough to meet wartime demands. The synthetic fuel program was working as designed, but it had been designed for peacetime needs, not for sustaining mechanized warfare on multiple fronts. Even at maximum production, synthetic plants could not produce enough fuel to support the operations that Germany's strategic situation required. The program had always been understood as a supplement to natural petroleum sources, not a replacement. Germany had gambled that synthetic fuel plus Romanian imports would suffice until conquered territory provided additional supplies. The gamble was failing. fuel shortages constrained operations across all fronts. By 1943 and 1944, fuel shortages were killing operations before enemy action could. German counterattacks were cancelled because panzer divisions lacked fuel to move. Luftwaffe fighters sat grounded while Allied bombers attacked because aviation fuel was insufficient. The Navy reduced submarine patrols due to diesel shortages. Training of new pilots was cut back because training consumed fuel needed for combat operations. The German military was being strangled not by enemy superiority but by resource constraints that logistics had predicted in 1940. Units that had fuel fought effectively. Units without fuel were strategically irrelevant regardless of their combat capability. The Wehrmacht was fighting a war where operational success was increasingly determined by fuel availability rather than tactical skill. German commanders found themselves making decisions based on fuel supplies rather than military opportunities. A tank division with empty fuel tanks had the same combat value as a division that did not exist. When Allied planners identified Germany's fuel dependency, they made synthetic fuel plants and transportation infrastructure priority bombing targets. The campaign was devastatingly effective. Synthetic fuel production dropped by more than half. Transportation of Romanian oil was disrupted. Storage facilities were destroyed. By late 1944, Germany was producing less fuel than required just for defensive operations. The Luftwaffe could barely fly. Panzer divisions were immobilized. Even tactical retreats were impossible because moving mechanized forces required fuel that did not exist. The Allied oil campaign was successful not because German synthetic technology failed but because Germany had never secured adequate natural petroleum sources. If Germany had prioritized oil security in 1940–41, either by focusing solely on Caucasus conquest or by completing sufficient synthetic capacity before expanding the war, Allied bombing would have faced much more resilient targets. Instead, Allied planners found a critical vulnerability that German decisions had created and exploited it ruthlessly. In the war's final months, German forces often remained stationary not from lack of combat capability but from total absence of fuel. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944 was planned around capturing Allied fuel supplies because German stocks were exhausted. When that failed, German mechanized forces were effectively finished. Infantry divisions could still fight, but they could not maneuver without trucks that lacked fuel. Artillery could not be repositioned. Air support was non-existent. German forces in 1945 fought essentially as static infantry while Allied forces operated with complete mobility. This was the final consequence of the 1940 decision to expand the war without securing oil. Germany had fielded technically sophisticated weapons, trained excellent soldiers, and developed advanced tactics. None of it mattered when those forces could not move because petroleum did not exist. The Wehrmacht ended the war possessing military capability that could not be employed because the fuel to employ it had never been secured. When military historians analyze Germany's defeat, fuel shortage appears repeatedly as a constraint that limited operations across all theaters and all phases of the war. This was not inevitable. Germany knew about its oil problem in 1939 and 1940. Professional advisors clearly identified the requirement to secure petroleum before expanding operations. Multiple options existed: focus the entire war effort on seizing Caucasus oil, complete the synthetic fuel program before major campaigns, or concentrate on driving Britain from the Middle East before opening other fronts. Each option required making resource security the primary strategic objective. Hitler chose instead to expand territory first and hoped that resources would follow. That decision was driven by ideological imperatives about racial empire and living space rather than by logistical requirements for sustaining mechanized warfare. The consequence was predictable and was predicted. Germany fought the entire war constrained by fuel shortages that affected every operation and eventually paralyzed military capability completely. The German fuel crisis demonstrates what happens when strategic expansion proceeds without securing the resources that operations require. Modern war consumes resources at industrial scales. Tactical brilliance cannot compensate for inadequate supply. Germany possessed technical expertise, operational doctrine, and trained forces. What it lacked was the petroleum to employ those assets effectively. This was not bad luck or unforeseeable circumstance. It was the logical consequence of decisions made by leadership that prioritized ideological objectives over material requirements. Professional military and economic advisors identified the problem early and clearly. They were overruled by political leadership that believed willpower would overcome logistics. The lesson extends beyond World War II. Strategic success requires matching operational objectives to available resources. When resource constraints are ignored in favor of ambitious expansion, those constraints eventually impose themselves regardless of tactical performance. Germany's fuel shortage was not something that happened to the Wehrmacht. It was something German leadership chose by expanding the war before solving the resource equation. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, its military forces were effectively immobilized by fuel exhaustion. Thousands of tanks, aircraft, and vehicles sat unused because petroleum did not exist to operate them. The technical sophistication of German weapons was irrelevant. The training of German soldiers did not matter. The operational doctrine that had achieved spectacular early victories could not be applied. All of it was nullified by the simple fact that modern mechanized war requires fuel, and Germany had never secured adequate supplies. The decision made in 1940 to expand the war without first solving the oil problem had created a constraint that worsened progressively until German military capability was completely paralyzed. Germany did not lose because it lacked soldiers or weapons or tactical skill. It lost partly because it never secured the petroleum that made those soldiers, weapons, and skills operationally relevant. That failure was not forced on Germany by circumstances. It was chosen by leadership that prioritized territorial expansion over resource security and dismissed professional warnings about the inevitable consequences.